Hey friends, welcome back to my kitchen. If you're new here, my name is Jen. I do cooking, canning, and food preservation videos, and sometimes I post garden vlogs as well. If that seems like the sort of content that you'd be into, I hope that you'll consider subscribing and sticking around. Today, I'm going to be showing you how to make one of my family's favorite candies for Christmas time. These are coconut cream candies, and they are super simple. There's no baking and minimal labor, and everybody will love them. These also make a fantastic gift if some of you prefer to give the gift of homemade goods around the holidays. So just keep that in mind when you're packing up candies this year, that these would make a fantastic gift. So the first ingredient I'm adding here is just sweetened coconut flakes. I am doubling this recipe and I'm going to list the recipe in the box below as a doubled recipe. So if you only want half of these candies, just split all of the measurements in half. I needed 5 cups of these coconut flakes, and it turned out to be the perfect amount for one of the big bags, the 14-ounce bags from Walmart. I just used the whole bag. The next ingredient is sweetened condensed milk. A doubled recipe calls for 1 cup, which just happens to be an entire can, the small cans. So that worked out perfectly. And just a little tip here, if you don't want to have to scrape out your measuring cups, just give it a quick spray with some nonstick cooking spray before you pour in your sweetened condensed milk and it'll slide right out. The next ingredient is a half a cup of unsalted butter melted. You don't want this to be hot, but it does need to be melted. Soften won't work well. It will not combine when you go to mix everything together. So make sure it's just melted and let it cool a little bit before you add it in. Then I'm going to add 2 teaspoons of vanilla. Rule of thumb with vanilla is add as much as you like, but I went ahead and followed the recipe and I just added 2 teaspoons. You also want to add about a half a teaspoon of salt. Now, if you didn't have unsalted butter and you had to use salted butter, that's fine. Just omit the salt from this next step. You don't want these candies to be overly salty, and we're going to garnish the tops of these with some flaky sea salt at the end. So just keep that in mind. If you're using salted butter, just leave the salt out when you're mixing the filling. You're just going to give this all a really good mix. If you have a Danish dough whisk, I highly recommend using that. This mixture is very sticky and it is very thick, and it takes some effort to get this mixed together. If you have a stand mixer, by all means, you can use that. I just didn't feel like having to clean it up when I was done, so I did this by hand. And the last ingredient that we're going to add is powdered sugar. Now, I'm going to tell you that you're going to add 3 cups in gradually. Now, this depends on your humidity, your sugar, how finely it's milled. The original recipe only calls for 2 cups of powdered sugar, but you need to use your best judgment when you're mixing this. The end result should be like a loose cookie dough. If you add too much powdered sugar and, your mixture becomes hard, when you make these candies and you bite into them, you won't get that creamy filling on the inside. And that's kind of what we're going for here. We don't want it to be solid like a nougat or something like that. When you break these open, and I'll show you at the end, you should be able to see the cream in them. So all of that is just to say, use between 2 and 3 cups of powdered sugar and stop when it gets to the consistency of a loose cookie batter. Now I'm using my smallest cookie scoop to make these candies. They're very sticky, they're very messy, and you could roll these by hand if you don't have a cookie scoop. That is fine. I would highly suggest oiling up your hands just a little bit before you do it. That way you don't end up with a sticky mess everywhere. Now my candies were a little big. They were about an inch in diameter, but this is the smallest cookie scoop I have, and that's okay. Instead of it being a 1-bite candy, they were a 2-bite candy, and nobody complained about it. So I'm just scooping these out onto a piece of parchment paper that I have on a flat cookie sheet. They look a little messy, but that's okay. We're going to go back here in just a minute and tidy them up. Now, I'm not sure, I didn't get a count of how many candies this made, this doubled recipe. Obviously, my candies are pretty big, so If you make them smaller, you're gonna get twice as many as I did, and I got quite a bit out of this. So just keep that in mind. These will store really well in the freezer, so if you make too many, just pop some in a baggie and toss them in the freezer for when you decide that you want a little chocolate in your life. So I'm just taking oiled hands here and kind of rolling the balls up a little bit to tighten up the filling and make them a little neater. And then I'm going to pop these into my deep freezer while I get my chocolate ready for them to dip. I don't own a fancy double boiler. I just used a saucepan and a metal bowl, and I just sit one on top of the other. You do not want the water in your double boiler to actually be boiling. You just want it to be hot enough to warm the bowl that you put inside of it. Now you can use dark chocolate chips for this or milk chocolate chips, but I purchased some Ghirardelli chocolate wafers a while back from the Mennonite salvage store, and this was exactly why I bought them. I got them at a really good price, and I knew I was going to be needing them around the holidays to make candy. And the chocolate is a little bloomed, but that does not affect the taste or the quality of the chocolate. They just look a little funny when you first put them in. So I'm going to let these sit until they start to melt, and then I'm going to stir them occasionally so that they don't burn or scorch to the pan. You want to make sure that your bowl is very dry before you put your chocolate in. If any water gets into your chocolate, it's going to seize up and it's going to make it lumpy and it's going to give it a really strange texture. So just make sure your bowl is dry before you add your chocolate chips or your melting wafers, and just stir it until it's melted. Alternatively, you can do this in the microwave in a glass bowl. You'll just need to check on it every so often and give it a stir. Now, I added just about a tablespoon of coconut oil to my chocolate so that once the chocolate's set up, it would be nice and glossy. This step is totally optional. If you don't do this, your chocolates will just have a more dull finish to them. So after my coconut balls sat in the freezer for about 15 minutes while I melted my chocolate, they became much easier to handle, and now they're firm enough that I can use a skewer or toothpick to dip them into the chocolate. Now, I thought I had some barbecue skewers. I can't find them. I don't know what I did with them, so I resorted to toothpicks. This worked okay, but it was kind of a pain because the toothpicks were so short. I couldn't really spin the chocolates to get the excess off. And you definitely want to tap them on the side of the bowl or spin them if possible, because you'll see these first few I do here end up with a little puddle of chocolate underneath of them as they're setting up, and that's not ideal. You don't really want that. So I actually ended up switching over to a fork after I cut the camera because I thought that would be easier. I could just tap the fork on the side of the bowl, and that worked really well to get off the excess chocolate. So the ones that I did towards the end had a better look to them, but, use what you have, toothpicks, skewers, a fork, it doesn't matter. You just wanna do your best to get any extra chocolate coating off before you set it onto the parchment. Now at this point, you're gonna wanna work as quickly as possible to get these dipped in this chocolate. The longer the chocolate stays on the double boiler, the more chances you have of the chocolate scorching to the bowl. So if you're doing this with a microwave instead of a double boiler, at some point you may have to reheat your chocolate or you may have to start a new chocolate batch. Just keep an eye on it, and if it starts to seem like it's getting lumpy, either try reheating it or starting a fresh batch of chocolate. Now, while these have a little bit of stickiness to them still, they're not completely set up, I'm going to use my spatula to kind of fill in the little hole in the top where I had the toothpick. And then I'm going to finish these off with that really nice flaky sea salt that I showed you in the previous frame. And in my opinion, the flaky sea salt just added a whole nother layer to these candies because when you ate them, you got the crunch from the sea salt, and sea salt lends well really nicely to dark chocolate. But if you didn't want to do that, you could just put a little bit of toasted coconut flake on the top of these. That would work really well. Or you could even melt some white chocolate wafers and drizzle that over the top if you wanted them to be just a little bit prettier. But all in all, these are a delicious candy, and you'll see here, I'm going to cut it open and show you what the inside looks like. It's creamy, and the outside is just beautiful and snappy, so I really hope that you give these a try. Until next time, friends, happy cooking.